So just to say, as Mickey said, both Poppy and I have spent some time in the West Bank in some sort of a role, but including protective presence. Poppy went twice, as we'll hear, with the International Solidarity Movement, 20 years apart. And I went with the, wait for it, Ecumenical Accompaniment Program in Palestine and Israel, an unbelievable 14 years ago. So mostly this is going to be me asking Poppy questions, but she is keen that I also share my own experience when appropriate, which I will do. And I'm sure there's people here who will have spent time, or who may have spent time in the West Bank. So it'd be good to hear your experiences and ideas as well as any questions. Okay, so my first thing is to ask Poppy, before we get going with our own experience and observations, can you tell us what you understand by protective presence and how that differs from being a witness, for example, which certainly when I was there was part of my role, and why you think being there is important?
Well, let's start with the first one.
Yeah.
So my understanding is that protective presence is a concept that grew up around the time of the new century, new millennium, sort of alongside the United Nations concept of civilian protection, unarmed civilian protection. And that was conceived due somewhat to the failures of the United Nations peacekeeping operations in places such as Somalia, Rwanda, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. And protective presence is the idea that we foreigners stand next to vulnerable communities subject to attack, and that our presence deters violations, deters violence. The principles being applied include that the possibility of us being witnesses in any future prosecution. We would pressure our governments that would then pressure the local government, and the possibility of pricking the perpetrator's conscience. Can they bear to be seen committing their violations? So that is one important aspect of protective presence. Another is documenting. So the idea is that we are there and we are also recording what's going on.
Thanks. We'll get on to limitations a bit later, but can you tell us, hold on, I've got to find the exact question. Tell us about your most recent experience of being in the West Bank.
Sure.
For example, tell us when it was,
Sure.
why you went, and what you did there.
Okay.
And tell us about the people and communities you worked with.
Thank you. That really is sort of, for me, the core purpose of this meeting. It's just that when I was there, I was constantly beset with the question, am I doing any good? So this is what I'm doing. This talk is part of my processing of what good was I doing. So I left on the 28th of October, 2024, spent November, December 2024, and the bulk of January 2025, my 3-month visa, and then I came back on the day on which the so-called Gaza ceasefire was announced. So that's when I got back. Initially, I was posted to the North Jordan Valley, where the International Solidarity Movement, ISM, has a guest house and has a posting. And we were serving 3 or 4 Bedouin communities. We call them communities. They're little families, really, who were camped in the area, on the sand, sometimes by the road, sometimes way off the road. And they were all at risk of attack. In the case of Farsia, they had recently returned, having been displaced earlier by attack. And if you can imagine these camps, these are ramshackle encampments with improvised pens for the animals and very, very sort of improvised again, sort of shelters for the people. With no facilities. I mean, hygiene is a puzzle, really, completely off the grid. Um, so, water, electricity, all of these have to be improvised. In fact, in one of the encampments, the one that became my favorite, I got talking to an aid worker for Médecins du Monde, which is a lovely aid organization and only hires local people. And he told me, did you know that that they stop these people's water at the checkpoints? I said, so they have to smuggle their water in? Yeah. Um, um, and these communities needed our help at night and in the morning. That was when the greatest likelihood of an attack would come. At night, because that's where they were. And in the morning, when shepherds took their flocks out to graze on the hillsides, those shepherds might come under attack. So that was when we were needed. Um, and as I say, I served 4 different communities, but one of them became my favorite. In the end, I said, I'm only going there. I'm only serving with Hamamat al-Malih, which was the nicest encampment. It was by a lovely stream, a wadi. It had a booth that was a seemingly working toilet, and one could sleep under cover because their communal tent had a roof made of doors. So, so that was the place that I served in. For the most part, others were even more primitive. We would be sleeping outdoors on a trailer. When I say sleeping, not so much in my case. After a stint there, I then served the rest of my time in Hebron, which is not a rural community, but it is a city at the heart of which is a very heavily guarded, fenced off, and gated area where these swivel-eyed fanatical Jews have established their settlement. I mean, local Palestinians also live there, but that is the Hebron settlement, what's known as H2. And we did a lot of documenting and supporting mostly the shopkeepers in the souk who felt vulnerable because the settlers would be throwing things from above. And every Saturday they would emerge from their settlement and have a march through the old city as a kind of show of strength. And at one point towards the end of my stay, armed men, they could be police, they could be soldiers, they could be border force, would come out of the checkpoint into the souk and order the shopkeepers in the nearby area to close. And there's a story I can tell you about that as well. So that was the broad outline of my service.
So why don't you tell us that story?
Well, I suggested, because, my feeling is we are not here simply to stand and witness. We're here to confront the occupation. So I said to my comrades, we called each other, not my choice. Uh, I said, why don't we arrive early, sit here by the checkpoint, and maybe it will deter the armed men from coming in and closing the shops. So one morning, 5 of us or so arrived early. Plastic chairs were provided in this, if you can imagine the old lane of the souk. This is very much like the old city of Jerusalem. It's an Ottoman-built stone souk. It's very romantic, very oldie-worldy. But this particular alley, which is also covered with an Ottoman arch, was blocked with a checkpoint. And I said, why don't we stay? So they put out a couple of chairs and we sat there, as I hoped, for nothing. Let's wait for nothing. Nothing will happen. Our presence should deter the soldiers. So then it got to lunchtime. People got hungry. One or two of us went off, bought some falafels and pita, brought them back. And just as the falafels were in our hands, these soldiers, oh, police actually, they were policemen, came out of the checkpoint and imperiously in Hebrew started telling the shopkeepers to close their stores. And I jumped up. I thought, this is what I'm here for, right? I mean, they were not supposed to come through. The shopkeepers uncomplainingly started to pack up their display tables. But I was bobbing up and down like a faulty fountain in front of the faces of these two armed men. And I was going, what are you doing? These people are just trying to do their business, and I'm holding up this pita like I've got some offering for them. And he said, you go there. And I was certainly not going to go there. So I bobbed up and down. I went to the other one and I said, why are you doing this? These people are just trying to do their business. And he went, oh, they were making a mess on the other side. I said, no, they weren't. They were here the entire time. And then my colleagues told me, my comrades told me that they thought they heard him say, they are Hamas. And of course, once you brand a Palestinian Hamas, anything you do is justified. It's fine, Um, um, any punishment, pointless punishment you want to impose on the Palestinians is justified. They're Hamas. My comrades didn't come and support me. They didn't come to join me. And the shopkeepers were putting their things away. So I backed off. Because, of course, if I upset the soldiers, it is not I who's going to suffer the worst brunt. It'll be the people left when I've gone away. And because you're not supposed to take action in the field as an ISMer on your own. You're always meant to be with a buddy or others. And that's part of the rules. So I backed off. I was disappointed with my comrades. Needless to say, I can also blame myself somewhat in that we hadn't explicitly planned what we would do should the soldiers arrive. One is meant to plan in advance. I failed to do that, however. One of my comrades, Phil, was filming, and the soldier, one of the policemen went up to him and demanded that he delete the film, which he did, and he felt ashamed afterwards. And I also felt ashamed for him afterwards too. Yeah, my comrades, they weren't the most effective necessarily.
Sorry, there may be some outside noise, hence I'll mute when I can. I think what you've said, and there may be some questions and contributions from the floor about this, but we may come back to it, the dilemmas, because that awareness that you can make a big fuss, and certainly until recently, you would be reasonably safe, but any annoyance would be taken out. So how to be effective is always the issue. I can say with the EAPPI program, it's a World Council of Churches program. It was requested back in 2002 while the Second Intifada was going on. And there's very strict rules, and it's and a lot of that's very similar, that you don't act on your own, but also you don't initiate, that you're very much there in support of, and you take the lead from the Palestinians. But it's very, very difficult. By contrast, I was in the South Hebron Hills. I was frequently in Hebron. So those of you who don't know the geography very well, it's literally the southern part of the West Bank. And while I was there, so the area that I was working in was included Masafa Yatta, which has become a bit more known, and particularly because of the film No Other Land. And the film got an Oscar, and it exposed the settler violence, which obviously Poppy, you were describing in the North Jordan Valley more recently.
It was much
From
worse in Masafayata, much worse. Yeah.
Well, Masafayata is worse, and ironically, well, not ironically perhaps, but the film, because that point you were making about witnessing, recording, is the film got known and people saw the reality, and actually the violence rose afterwards in those communities. Um, so it's always a dilemma to know what you know, was that point you were making, Poppy, how effective are you being? The time when I was there, and which was 2012, it was a relatively quiet period, and 1 month of my 3 months was Ramadan, and at that time the Israelis respected Ramadan, so nothing happened during Ramadan. No evictions, no demolitions. The day after was the day I witnessed demolitions. And so I do want to convey to everybody, there's something about those of us who've been following this for some time. I didn't see anything that I didn't know happened. And yet there's something about seeing it with your own eyes that is still hard to believe. So the thing that I found hard to believe that I witnessed was the destruction of water systems in the desert in August, pouring stones and oil into newly repaired. That's all. They weren't new systems. These were biblical era systems, but and destroyed 4 water systems in different parts of the of Masafiyata, and destroyed an animal pen, you know, that's improvised, as you said, and one tent that had been erected illegally that some guests were staying in. Yeah, and I say even now, you know, I literally saw it with my own eyes. I filmed it, I photographed it. I went and visited the most affected families the next day, and still found it ridiculous that that could happen. The one thing I did want to also ask you was how you found how what the communities that you were working with felt about you, because I about your presence, about ISM, about your work, because I was, and again, I know things are much worse, so you might want to start thinking about any differences between your first time and now. I was amazed at how welcoming people were, how pleased they were to see me and us, and many groups work closely with Israeli peace organizations as well, Rabbis for Human Rights, even Combatants for Peace, even Breaking the Silence, the Villages group, which some of you may know about. And I'm just interested to know what your experience of that was and what differences you noticed between the two, your two trips.
Ah, okay.
Trips is
So
a sorry, it's a very, don't mean to be
the
so
difference between
superficial,
the
but
two trips. So I was there in 2005 and in 2025. So there were, and the differences were significant. Um, First of all, we volunteers with ISM were a mere handful. We were most of us ordinary, middle-aged people. We certainly didn't expect to be detained or questioned or shown much aggression from anyone but the settlers, and their attacks were very sporadic. The tactics that ISM was using were more fitting to the circumstances. So, for example, I was posted to a village that was being where the army was coming in nightly to harass a family, one or perhaps two of whose scions was considered a terrorist. Um, so we showed up, we were welcomed. That night, the army came, and we were all turfed out of our beds, but I don't remember it being particularly late. And we all sat in chairs around the room. And the soldiers were very amused to find us there and addressed me in Hebrew. I replied in English, but we had a chat. And then the following day, They declared a curfew, meaning that none of the Palestinians were allowed to leave their homes. But we, volunteers, knew that we were free to move around because the soldiers wouldn't harm us. So we would go and speak to the soldiers, we would liaise with them, we would take parcels from one house to another, we would accompany the health workers between houses, and we would accompany farmers to their fields, knowing that we were offering a pretty effective service to the people in the village who otherwise would stuck in their homes without recourse. That phenomenon has ceased to be the problem. The problem is now the settlers. So the things that had happened between my first visit and my second visit include things like the election in 2022 of Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the, as it were, formalizing of the settlers as a militia through the distribution of huge numbers of weapons to them, with the explicit purpose of harassing the Palestinians in the rural areas, out of the rural areas. So those things are what have changed. The number of settlements and and outposts that have been approved has increased dramatically in that time. And the violence has escalated eye-wateringly, and the impunity has come in. So now the settlers and the soldiers, who never did enforce the law on Israelis, they now ignore it also when it's perpetrated against the foreigners. So those were the main differences between my first visit and my later visit. My first visit, we would sleep at night in the room that we had been assigned, and it was the best sleeps I've ever had in my life. And I came to believe that the reason for that was my sense of my just being there justified my existence, and all my existential angst was calmed down, and I was able to sleep. And I was kind of looking forward to the same thing this time. No way. This time it was at night that we were needed. And I hardly slept at all, and I went a bit doolally. And and that is why I moved to Hebron, because I knew then that I wouldn't be required to serve overnight. Yeah.
That's really, really interesting. And what about how the people you're working with, the communities, did you see any difference in terms of how they responded to you and others?
Um, when I was in the North Jordan Valley, I was serving with the Bedouin. I had not served with them before.
Mm.
The Bedouin are the most marginalized, most deprived, most discriminated against group within Palestinian society. While I was at Hammamet al-Maleh, there was one day when a vet came down to inoculate the flock. And he's an English speaker. So I said to him, listen, could you ask why little Mustafa didn't get on the bus to go to school this morning? And he said, oh, don't worry about that. They're all stupid, and gestured at the Bedou, knowing that they wouldn't understand what he was saying because he was speaking English to me. Just an illustration. So we're talking about a very different kind of community to the ones that I was serving with elsewhere. Everybody welcomes us. Everybody welcomed us. Yasser, who was the patriarch, and it's funny to call Yasser a patriarch because he was a young man in his 30s, but he had this gravitas and this sense of authority about him that clearly entitled him to the title, the paterfamilias of that group. He said to me, I'm really happy that you are here. I'm glad you are here, because they come at night, they harass us, they demand to see our identification papers, but when they see you, they back off. And there was another occasion on which I joined with some of my comrades to go to Farsia to talk to Mansour, because my comrades who had been there overnight were finding it difficult to leave, and they were feeling awkward. So I said, I will go with the relief party. I speak Hebrew. Mansour speaks Hebrew. We'll try and sort it out. And the first thing he said when we arrived there is, "What is the point of view? You know, what the point is the point of view?" And I was going, "This is a question I've been asking myself all my life, Mansour." And he was complaining because the settlers had brought a herd of cows to graze on the top of the hill above his encampment, inhibiting him from grazing his flock. So he sent us to go and observe at the bottom of the hill, which we did. And a couple of settlers came on their all-terrain vehicles, their ATVs. It's a kind of a souped-up quad bike, which is their mode of transport in the desert. And they came and they saw us and came past us and went to the top of the hill and had a word with the young shepherd. I'm assuming he was young. The young shepherd there with the cows, the cow herd. Then they came back down. They didn't talk to us. They didn't address us. The ISM rules were, you don't talk to settlers. So I knew that. Mustn't talk to the settlers. And then the cows disappeared. And then Mansour's sons brought his flocks out to graze on the hillside. But they have no other recourse. They have no other defense. This is Area C, where Israel is in sole control according to the Oslo Accords of security. And the local Bedu, their only recourse is us. That's all they've got. And we are, we're so they are very welcoming of us. I should mention that none of the 3 or 4 encampments that I served with are still there. They've all been expelled. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of these villages and hamlets in Masafayata have also gone now. So it's working for the Israelis.
That's what Arik Asherman says in this article that you directed me to and you circulated on the JVL website. He said that settlers are winning. And that's because the level of violence being shown are so high now. ISM no longer describes what it offers as protective presence. And my understanding is that that designation was dropped for 2 reasons. One is because it's no longer seen as an effective protection. And secondly, because it helps the volunteers not to become subject to what ISM calls saviorism. I leave you to work out what that might be about.
Yes, I think that's clear.
What they're doing now is solidarity presence. So if you can imagine you are a community that feels besieged, it's much nicer to have somebody there to metaphorically hold your hand, to be there as a moral support. We can have a debate over whether the documenting is effective or not. And you and I can talk about that. But there is no question but that you would rather have somebody on your side, by your side, when you're feeling besieged than not. And you mentioned Andrei X, who is a Russian-Israeli activist on the West Bank. He wrote an article saying protective presence doesn't work anymore and ended it with the conviction that the point that we have, the reason we are welcomed is solidarity.
as by the way, this was in an email exchange that I mentioned that, just because we haven't mentioned him so far. Um, I'm just going to throw in a little bit about other experience I had, because the part of the responsibilities, and it is very much the monitoring and recording. So we did a lot of that while I was there. We monitored how many olive trees had been cut down in an attack. We monitored the checkpoints regularly, and I don't know if this is totally right, but I think it's interesting. I monitored one checkpoint twice a week, which was a green line checkpoint. And I also, during my stint, I monitored checkpoint 300, which is the checkpoint, the Bethlehem checkpoint that takes you from the south into Jerusalem.
Right. So you're drawing a distinction between checkpoints inside the West Bank and those that separate the West Bank from Israel proper. Is that what you're doing?
Well, I'm just sort of describing where I happen to observe the differences. And I also did one stint in the very early hours at Kalkilia. And Kalkilia is completely surrounded by the wall. And these were all, but these, the Green Line checkpoints and the Green Line checkpoint and the Kalkilia checkpoint were about workers from Palestine crossing into Israel. And I think I'm saying this in terms of the dehumanization. So the Greenpoint checkpoint, the Machzor Watch, which is an Israeli Jewish women who've been monitoring checkpoints for a very long time, they said it was the best checkpoint in the whole of the West Bank.
What does that mean?
Well, it meant that, well, and they told me why. So the person who was in charge of that checkpoint told the staff that their job was to get the Palestinians, he might have called them Arabs, I don't know, to their jobs. These were workers, and their job was to check their credentials so that they could. It's the same job as that was happening in Kalkilia. But the person in Kalkilia who was in charge told his workers that their job was to catch terrorists. It's exactly the same job, and the attitudes were completely different. It was a much bigger checkpoint at Kalkilia, much more crowded. It was so bad, and the treatment of people was so bad, and the pushing and shoving and the desperation, that eventually the Palestine General Federation of Trade Unions organized volunteers to look after the queues. And they were brilliant. They had very good techniques for calming people down. And when it was time that they needed to cross through, everyone stepped out of the way and sent them to the front of the queue. And I actually, just by pure coincidence, that team, because that was the team that was based in Jayus in the north, and that was part of their duties, that team had been trying to meet with the trade unions, and they rang while we were at the checkpoint at about 5:30 in the morning to say, oh, if you'd like to meet today. So my colleague asked if I'd like to come as well. So yes. And I asked them why they did that, because that was a way of propping up the occupation, sort of. And this gentleman just looked at me and he said, well, if the Israeli army do it, they will be brutal. We lost in the crush, people, I think somebody broke their leg. I think somebody may have been crushed to death in the past. And they didn't want the Israeli army coming in, which is understandable. But that's another dilemma the Palestinians are dealing with. If we don't cooperate, then they just come in with their brutality. I throw that in.
Yeah, I have a couple of stories to respond with. One is about the checkpoint in Hebron. So there are a number of checkpoints in Hebron. And the main one is the one that leads into the cave of, where Abraham, what's it called?
Cave of the Patriarchs.
The Cave of the Patriarchs, that's right. What the local people call the Al-Ibrahimi. And there was one occasion on a Friday when I was talking with Hisham, who runs the sesame oil mill and trinket shop. and had lived for many years in Manchester as a dental technician. So he was a favorite because his English is very good and he was very, very friendly. And he evinced the opinion that the most use that we foreigners are in the West Bank is that we spend money in the souk. And we bring our relatives and they spend money into the economy. And I completely accept this. I mean, why not let you know the economy is on its knees? But then it was coming up to midday, and he said, "Why don't you go and stand by the checkpoint?" Because it was Friday, time for the main prayer. "Why don't you go and stand by the checkpoint?" And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you might encourage the soldiers to be less difficult, brutal, uh, more blocking." And I loved the way he seemed to contradict himself on the one hand, and on the other, he did believe that my presence at the checkpoint might help people get through. So yeah, yeah.
I think we need to start thinking about throwing it open. But so you're saying about the monitoring, because one of the key things that people said to me, tell our story, tell our story. People must know, people must know. And with the EAPPI, you're required to do at least 10 public sessions where you talk absolutely about what you have witnessed and you in the context of international law. Not my opinions, not my, so after a while I couldn't do it anymore. But I did about 120, I think, certainly over 100. And that's because I was lucky enough to be, had been made redundant, which is why I could go. And so I had time. People, that was 2012. So people know. People certainly know now, as well as the horrors in Gaza. There have been a number of programs and news items about settler violence in the West Bank. And yet, and on the other hand, I was at a conference the weekend and Francesca Albanese zoomed in, and she was absolutely clear, however frustrated we feel, that it is working. It is making a difference. So I'm just interested in your own take on that in terms of efficacy of recording, because you raised it. I'm going to cough.
Okay, I will give you mine, and then I think we should ask for other people's as well. The question is, what is working? The other one is that we are in an extremely imperfect world, and this, what you were calling dilemmas, are really the fixes, the tight spots we find ourselves in such an imperfect world. I mean, one could argue that protective presence in and of itself is a colonialist concept, since it's us Westerners with our passports and our identities that protect us and allow us to deter violence. But it's compromised, as it were, ab initio, from its own concept. It's a compromised concept. I've read a long article that makes a number of anti-colonialist critiques of protective presence, and we can send the link around if people want it. But the problems that that article is highlighting are ones that are inherent in the nature of the situation. If the Palestinians are prevented from taking part in the international financial framework, then they need our financial help, because we were going to talk about what can we do. If protective presence isn't working, what can we do? And donating money certainly is. And of course, that creates dependency. It means that those recipients dare not say things that might put us off. So it's like policing their speech, if you like. But what's the alternative? That we don't donate? And this question of what is working, uh, uh, is there a difference between awareness raising, education, and advocacy and achievement? Do we make a distinction between those categories and just raising awareness, what's it going to achieve? I mean, I would like to know what people have to say about all that. I saw no explicit violence while I was away. And I cannot help believing that that was in some extent due to my having been there. Right? There was one occasion when a settler came up towards Diab's flock, and when he saw us, he turned around and went away. I have a feeling he wanted to kidnap the donkey. That was what I think he wanted to do. I can't know that. I asked Diab afterwards, and Diab shrugged and said, who knows? There was an occasion on which I witnessed a couple of soldiers searching a car in Hebron that they had stopped. I don't know whether randomly or not. And although they kept the man by his car for half an hour, they showed him no violence. Again, me and my comrades, we were there very evidently. So that's no longer the case. ISM now tells its volunteers you can expect to get beaten up. It's now, if you're going to be there for 2 or 3 months, and every volunteer I've spoken to who was there in the last few months has been beaten up. Not very badly. And having been zip-tied and blindfolded, it is the settlers who then take off the blindfolds and undo the zip ties before they leave. Um, so I'm just reflecting on that.
Thank you so much, Poppy. I think this is a good time. We don't have great conclusive things, but I really welcome any questions,
Contributions.
Exactly, any contributions, any ideas that you may have for what we are doing or can do that is effective. So thank you so much. So questions. I've got Agnes. Agnes, do unmute and come in.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'd just like to mention something which a lot of you may know about anyway, but perhaps not, so I'm going to mention it. So there is this young man from America called Sam who regularly goes and takes part in this protective Sam Sherman, by the way, and he regularly goes to Palestine, Israel, and takes part in the protective project. And he wrote an amazing play about it. And there were 5 performances of it about 2 months ago here in London. I did try to tell people to come and attend. And I still think that that play should be performed in lots and lots of places. It's very, very powerful. It's only partly about his protective presence, but what he did, the play is about his grandfather's leftover letters and diary, what his grandfather did during the Second World War, fighting the fascists. And that was and that was set together with what Sam is doing in Palestine. And I just think that that's a very powerful way of drawing attention to it. And so basically that's what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to get you curious and interested. Very few of you came, which is a shame. Apart from everything else, it's a powerful piece of theater. He's a great actor. So it was a great evening out in the theater, and that is his topic. And he also writes about his parents' reaction to him going to Palestine because they're scared that the Israelis are going to kill him and they don't want him to go there, but he still goes there because he looks at his grandfather's letters, what he did against the fascists. So anyway, that's my point because
Thanks.
Yeah, that's my
Yeah.
point.
Thank you, Agnes. And yeah, hopefully it'll be on again. Next I've got Nira and then Mickey.
Okay. Thank you very much for both of you for the stories.
I know this secondhand mostly through my Israeli feminist friends who have been for many years in Mahsom Watch and then also working with the Bedouin. One of them, Anat Matar, actually gave a webinar to JVL, but not on that, but on the whole issue of what is happening in the universities and academic freedom. And I think so much of what you said and all the dilemmas that you are talking about, on one level, of course, are true, but on another level, as you said, not only the usefulness, but also the human encounter. I think the controversy about the role of Yuval in the No Other Land film and Oscar, and that the BDS at first campaign was trying to boycott this, and then under the pressure of the Palestinians and the local Palestinians who were involved, and who highlighted how much the involvement of Yuval was not kind of top-down colonial charity and so on, but actually engaging in resistance and help, and the whole issue, I think, is very much to the point here. But I think what you also came out very strongly, both of you, especially you, Leah, came in a very different historical point, because I think after the 7th of October, and of course, with the extreme right government in Israel, things have changed. What would have changed would have taken much longer time to change. And first of all, I think it was the sense of shame, because the so-called protective presence works on the sense of shame that the Israeli settlers or soldiers or whatever might have, as well as, of course, fear of exposure to the wide world. This sense of shame has disappeared now, because it has become normalized that we are where we are, and also the difference between the settlers and the army and the kind of and the local police have become much more blurred, not only because of the settlers got much more weapon, but because of the presence of more settlers in the army, that their importance in the army has become much more different. So I think we are in a historical process that in which quantitative change have become qualitative change, and in a way looking at and trying to evaluate the importance, it's not a static phenomena, and therefore the answer cannot be static. But of course, for one of the things for my Israeli friends were that the humanization of the Israeli Jews and the Palestinians to each other by just being together rather than the demonic other, which is absence, I think has been also important. And because they were working not in a colonial way, but in a mutual, respectful, transversal solidarity way. And I think the courage of all of you, but also of the Israelis and all those who continue to be beaten up. But of course, as you said, most of them, virtually all of them, I think now, have been forced off the land. So not sure what is happening now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nira. And I think that's an important point about the historical context. And one thing I've got to say is I think Poppy's experience is fairly unique, being 20 years apart. But even in the nearly 18 months since she's been back, she was already post October the 7th, it's much, much worse. Anyway, sorry, I'm intervening there. Mickey, do you unmute? Thanks, Nira.
Thank you both. It was incredibly moving and important that you both talked about it, and in particular you, Poppy, about what has been happening more recently. And course, I agree with Nira that the times have changed and got worse. But my points and questions are about, I was involved with setting up the British Shalom Salam Trust over 20 years ago now, out of Jews for Justice for Palestinians. And we funded a number of projects on the West Bank, as well as in Israel, and joint projects of that kind. And we continue to raise money. And one of the points that you made, Poppy, I think, was about whether or not the money merely exacerbates the situation in a way. And I continue, since I left being a trustee of BSST over 10 years ago now, but I still give a direct debit and have continued to do so. And I wonder about its efficacy now, although it still contributes, I know, to some of the projects on the West Bank and across the Green Line. And so I want to throw back at you this question about whether that giving money of that kind is at all appropriate now. And secondly, I wanted to address the question that you raised, Leah, but left hanging, I felt, which is the one about sexual violence. And I know you and I talked about that in different ways, but I just wonder if you can, Poppy, you said you didn't witness any, I think, but I just wonder how much more now the IDF are committing sexual violence on the West Bank, and with particular groups such as the ones you mentioned, like the Bedouin or other communities in Hebron, and what evidence there is about this, and what in particular we can do about that. And then finally, I just wanted to say that I actually found No Other Land incredibly powerful and important and upsetting. And you've mentioned, both of you mentioned parts of it. I think the thing that stayed with me most was the way in which they, through the idea, put stones and rocks and concrete down the wells. And it just moves me to tears, and it's unspeakable. That's a final point. But anyway, I'd love to know more about A, money, and B, sexual violence.
Do you want to come in now, or shall we take Richard as well, Poppy?
I think we should let Richard speak.
We'll let Richard speak. Thank you so much, Mickey. Richard.
Yeah, apologies for having missed the beginning of the webinar, but I heard a good deal and found it very, very interesting and very informative. It seems to me that the ISM has got it right, that it is solidarity. And there are times when solidarity can take the form of protective presence, and there are times when it takes the form of just bearing witness, being a support, being available, being around. And what is possible does shift and change over time. And Neera is absolutely right that it has become incredibly difficult now. If the people you are up against have no sense of shame or common humanity, you're not going to kind of change their minds about what they're doing. But the other point I wanted to make concerns the point Mickey raised, and would be interested in your reply on money. I know BSST has funded many projects in the West Bank and in Gaza when they've been able to do that. And I think the effectiveness of money depends on who you're funding and what they're doing. And there is a huge amount of variation. I think it's probably very unwise to generalize. I mean, paying for someone in the South Hebron Hills a wage to drive the bus so that kids could go to school, one of the more trivial projects that BSST has been involved in, seems to me an entirely good thing to be supporting and encouraging. It doesn't seem to me to have a downside. And I think one has to say, the different charitable organizations we know, some are awful, some waste the money they get, some, are into self-aggrandizement and so on. And you have to check who you give funds to and what they're doing with them. I think BSST has a fantastic record. And I would strongly encourage people to give money to them. They give money to groups who do not have the wherewithal to make standard applications to normal charitable bodies who demand things in set formats, but and ongoing returns and so on. It's very bureaucratic for most of them. BSST has prided itself in being very effective in identifying projects which require people not to have to go through hugely formal processes to get money, but they're very, very good at kind of keeping in touch with them, maintaining contacts. I was going to say vetting, that's not the right word, but in kind of working with them to see that they're able to achieve their aims and use the funds effectively. And some of that funding is actually to fund people who are there doing acts of solidarity with the groups you're talking about, which in a way links it all up. So I'd be very interested to hear your experience of how money has been used. But I do think, solidarity is the overarching concept and makes sense of what we try to do. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Poppy, I'll let you come in first. There's no other hands at the moment, but there's time for more. So if you think of a question or contribution, please just put your electronic hands up because we'll have another round. We have time. But Poppy, your initial thoughts to those questions and contributions.
Okay, so the week after I returned, the Israeli army went into the refugee camps of Jenin and Tulkarem and expelled the people. I mean, they just threw 40,000 people out of their homes to go where? To go where? My friend Adam, who is in Palestine at the moment, has a contact who had been one of these people who were expelled. So I donated a good 4 figures to his fundraiser. And when another contact of his was going to Palestine from Michigan, which is where he was living, she put the money in her bank account, went to the West Bank, got the money out of her bank account, gave it to Adam's contact, who distributed it in envelopes of 200 shekels to all the people in the vicinity where he was, in order to enable them to try and keep body and soul together, having been summarily, I don't know what the word is. I mean, they called it evacuated, but it isn't evacuation. It's displacement, expropriation, expulsion. And he is there now and fundraising for a similar cause. So that's been the way I have been donating, as it were, direct, no intermediaries, straight to the recipients. But I think that what Richard said is really important. My activism with JVL is relatively recent, and I cannot say that I have a very clear idea of, in fact, I have no idea, let's be honest. I'm just going to put my hands up here. Okay. I have no idea what the theory of change JVL has for making things better. If we are not in a position to lobby or do media work or go in numbers, the one thing we can do, And this is where Richard's recommendation is so helpful, is we can donate good money. And knowing that BSSD is a good route through which to send money to people who need it is a very, very important recommendation. I'm done. And I'm happy to hear replies and responses.
Absolutely. So I'll pick up some of the points. Because I don't think we can probably pick up on sexual violence here. I mean, it's not the sort of thing you would witness in any event. This is what happens behind closed doors, mostly to people who've been incarcerated. So I think it's a discussion for another day. I'm always happy to talk to you about it. You know, it's a great concern to me. Mickey and I have had exchanges, and but it's not something that we, a Western observer or just a non-Palestinian observer would see. On the raising money, I've been giving money to a family, just as of many people, an individual family in Gaza for about 8-9 years. I've upped the amount I send every month now. That's since October the 7th. I actually published some of our exchanges sometime ago, I think a year into the atrocities in Gaza, this set of atrocities. He's had a perfectly nice flat he lived there with his mother, his wife, and his 2 little girls. That's the very first night they bombed the apartment block next to him, where his cousin lived, and they were killed in the first night. He actually sent me a message saying they're doing genocide on us on October the 7th. And I'm thinking, why him? And then I think, why not? I can't, it's, the starfish thing, the little girl who's throwing starfish who've been washed up. They were all washed up on the beach, so she's throwing them back into the sea, and someone comes and say, oh, you can't save all the starfish. She goes, I've saved that one, saved that one. So we do what we can. But yes, BSST is very effective because they give small amounts. So they, hundreds or 1,000 or 2,000 rather than 50,000 that needs to be accounted for. But I think one of the, and actually one organization they used to support, which grew out of the Villages group, which is the Friends of Hebron International Resource Network, actually, it eventually needed so much money that so we've set up the UK Friends of her, and that organization. And this is direct money. And again, it's going direct to fund like solar panels and, drivers and vehicles to get children to school, very much things that Richard's very much grown out of that, and just trying to meet the needs, funding a kindergarten teacher and maybe funding the refurbishment of the kindergarten. And of course, in and of itself, it isn't going to change anything. But one of the strongest and most inspiring factors or features of Palestinian resistance is this sumud, which is resist by existing. You're not going to throw us out. We're not going anywhere. The people who don't want to leave Gaza. And if you can help people to stay and improve the quality of their life by providing solar panels, given, as Poppy said, most people are living off the grid, the transformation of people's lives in the South Hebron Hills, often people living in caves. So, for example, women they'd milk the sheep, and then they would tend to take it to market, and the roads were blocked. They had to throw all the milk away. Because they have solar panels, they can have a fridge. If they can't deal with the milk straight away, they can store it. Also, if they make butter from it, they can make it with very cold water, so the quality of the butter is better. So when they do get to sell it, they can get a better price. Also, children can do their homework much more easily because they can study at night, etc., etc. So I very much like those small direct projects where you just have to trust the people to get on, because they haven't got time to write you great long reports. they'll send you a picture, a few pictures saying, here are the children in the kindergarten. This is the money you sent is paying for this teacher. Someone just put in the chat, what about medical aid for Palestinians? There's some wonderful groups. I donate to medical aid for Palestinians. Also, as Poppy mentioned, Médecins Sans Frontières. Did you say? Anyway,
it was Médecins du Monde that I mentioned.
Oh,
I mean, and the worry with these international agencies is always how much of it is going on the bureaucracy. I mean,
yeah. But I think an important point that Poppy made, and where you can give directly, or when you're confident, like with medical aid for Palestine and so on, which was started by someone who'd spent time, I think, in the West Bank, the money is not going to be spent too much on the organizational aspects and on the admins, all of which is important. I'm not suggesting that it isn't, but it's also that question of, which Poppy was talking about, is this a very imperialistic thing? We in the West will drop some money to the poor people in Palestine. That isn't the spirit in which we give, but is it sometimes the spirit in which it's received? And are concerned about some of the bigger agencies. So this money, for example, that we raised for the UK Friends of Hebron International Resource Network, we couldn't get a bank account going. It just, for all the usual reasons. And we actually passed the money. The money all goes into the account of, it'll come back to me, but it's a Christian organization that does brilliant work, not only in Palestine, but elsewhere. I've completely forgotten the name of it. And they go out and visit. They go at least every 2 years. Someone will go and they will see the projects, not to go. And that's the way the accountability runs. So they send photographs, as I say, all the time. But it's
Do you mean
not
the Amos Trust?
The Amos Trust. Thank you so much. That was
welcome.
The name that wasn't coming. Thank you. So it is something about the direct contact. And very much BSST grew out of direct contact with people. Some initially through like the Villages Group, which is mostly Israeli, working mostly in the South Hebron Hills, but they go much, much wider, right around the West Bank and into Gaza. But it's about traditional grant aid, which is, as Richard said, wanting a lot of bureaucratic processes to apply, which they can't meet, but also the accountability. And if you're being evicted, you haven't got time to sit there and, the electricity just isn't working. Is your priority writing a report to your funder and we spent 322 shekels on X and we spent 926 shekels on Y? The outcomes were the key performance indicators were. It's meaningless for people in those situations. But giving money is a useful thing. Locally, I'm based in Hastings. Before October the 7th, the local Palestine Solidarity Campaign had created a link. It was a twinning link with Al-Mawasi, which everyone's heard of now, but at the time no one had heard of it. And that's very much direct contact. And the money just goes direct. We find ways of getting the money to them. But that's not to say not give money to Médecins Sans Frontières or Medical Aid for Palestine, but sometimes this just gets to those people who are the most desperate, and it won't get to all of them, and we have to live with that as well. Anyway, that's my long answer. I think, Charlotte, did you put a question in the chat? There's 6 new messages. You said you wanted to ask about green
olive.
Yes.
Who said
a bit more?
Well, Green Olive set up solidarity circles, and which I think are probably largely fundraising circles, but they also, it seems to me that they fund things that are quite similar to BSST, like Richard described, the bus, a bus to take kids to school or whatever it is, those quite sort of fundamental, simple projects. And I just wondered, I don't know if you've got any experience of them, Poppy or Leah.
I do. They were incredibly important to me while I was on the West Bank. While I was in the North Jordan Valley, Mohammed, who was one of the senior people in Green Olive and a tour guide showed up at the compound where we were staying, uninvited, unwelcome, actually, because my comrades were incredibly secretive and they didn't like visitors from outside coming, but he was showing a tourist around. So I met him and I met the tourist and I took his card because he lives in Jerusalem and has an Israeli address, which is incredibly proved to be, well, vital because I wanted to regularize my Israeli status while I was there. And that required an Israeli address. So I kept his card in my pocket. I told you I went a little doolally with a lack of sleep and the culture shock and the sense of being, well, I became technophobic at that time. And I got to such a pitch of derangement. I just sent out a text to everybody I could think of saying, help. And he wrote back and said, I'll buy you a coffee. So I went the next day to Jerusalem and he bought me a coffee and he gave me some really good advice. He says, look, Poppy, the dilemma you're in, just put it in the hands of a lawyer. And he showed me to a lovely guest house where I could stay and recover my mental health and recover my sleep. And he was so kind to me. And he introduced me to Fred Schlumke, who is the guy at the top of Green Olive. And Fred knew that I needed to go to Tel Aviv because I had collapsed on the hillside with sunstroke due to my anemia and I needed new iron pills. I needed to go to Tel Aviv. So I got a call from Netta, who is one of ISM, perhaps ISM's greatest eminence grise. She is one of those rare Israelis who's thrown her lot in with the Palestinians, has married a Palestinian man and lives on the West Bank against all the rules, which say that Israelis are not allowed in Area A, i.e. the Palestinian cities. And she rang me the day before I went to see Fred, after I had told her that I would be going to meet Fred, and warned me against him. He is a normalizer, she said to me. I wonder why she's telling me this, but never mind. Normalizer is a horrible insult that is bandied about very freely and often unfairly. Anyway, he doesn't believe in the right of return. This is not of the Jews to Israel, but of the Palestinians to their homes. So I went and I spent a couple of days with him in Tel Aviv, and he was so kind. And he took me to restaurants and introduced me to his friends. I have so much to thank Fred and Muhammad for. By the way, he does believe in the right of return, and he does not consider himself a liberal Zionist, as Netta had accused him of. I donate regularly to Green Olive, but mostly for sentimental reasons. I don't know how effective their work is, but they do really good solidarity work of keeping their circles. Every month, they have a Zoom call with a local Palestinian person talking about. And they had an interview with Houda Afelin the day before he was shot dead by a settler the following day. Yeah.
So you don't think that Green Olive is a normalizing organization? Because that's the thing. Before I came this evening, I think I had a lot more questions about the ethics, really, of protective presence. And actually, I've learned a lot this evening, and I feel differently about it now, because of what you've said and other people have said. And I wouldn't want to be involved in any kind of normalizing project.
Well, they're really nice people, if that's what you want, and I think they're well-meaning. But I can't, and I donate to them because they were so good to me, but I can't vouch for them. I think that the tours they run are good tours, and I would recommend them. And Charlotte, there are hundreds of ethical problems around all our work, protective presence, solidarity, money donating, and the rest of it. I've come to the view that one shouldn't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I, as a Jew, feel so strongly about this issue. I don't want to be excluded because somebody has some ethical problem with Jews with special access to the state and to visas offering support, which others can't because I have very little time for that kind of objection, which I've given a lot of thought to. And my final message, Leah, I'm happy to let other people speak, is if you can go, go. the likelihood is that you will not come to any harm and you will make a difference in the lives of the people you encounter. Even if you just go on a tour with ICAD or with Green Olive, or if you go to offer witness or protective, I mean, if you can, you should. That's my view. I'm done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thanks. And just before I bring Richard in again, I would absolutely endorse go, and people really appreciate it. And people appreciate you going and staying in a hotel in Bethlehem, you know, and I mean, there's that bit of normalizing. Like, this is a place I want to visit, and I'm not going to not go because it's difficult. But the dilemma, and Nira referred to it as well, that how pure do we have to be in our, so like when you're saying, oh, because an Israeli worked on the film No Other Land, that we should boycott the film. That wasn't my understanding of the BDS movement, which wasn't about boycotting individuals. And again, other people may say, and it is about the nature of the relationship. And they had to withdraw that. But it's, yeah, I think the way you put it was really helpful, like to not let the enemy be the perfection be the enemy of the good. So I'm interested in people's thoughts. So Richard, do unmute.
Just very briefly on the topic of normalization. I was involved in a project to supply books to Palestinian universities. It's been the best part of a year of my activist life, sorting books in the basement of the UCU, the National Union, which supported the project and publicized it. Birzeit University, in the end, refused to accept any books because they were being given in the name, they never gave a reason, but they were being given in the name of Faculty for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And although Birzeit had originally set up a tour I did around the West Bank, visiting all the universities and supplied all the contacts, they refused to accept a single book. Hebron and Bethlehem and elsewhere, Nablus, you know, took hundreds, thousands. But so there is a problem. I don't think the project of sending books to Palestine. People didn't ask me when I went around the universities, do you believe in the right of return? They didn't say, are you a liberal Zionist? They said, what? You want to give us some books? These are the areas we would like them in. And it worked very well. That's all I've got to say.
Yes. No, it's really interesting. I think we're coming towards, coming towards the end, but there really is time if people have another question or contribution to make. What I feel is that there's topics for, you know, more discussions. So inevitably, the ethical dilemmas, you know, how we deal with normalization, what is and what isn't normalization, when do we go over the line? Actually, I put something, I haven't put anything on the website for the last few days for reasons, technical reasons. But there was something I put about, which was an article, I can't remember where it was from, about do we let, you know, being pure actually keep us away from power? And one of the things, going back to Francesca Albanese at this conference, she said it was also really important to keep talking to the people you don't agree with. There's no point, and I don't think we're talking about hardened, you know, that we're not, you know, the settlers who are coming down to attack. But we hope that there will be other people who would still be shameable and or could be shamed out of their support, thinking about this country. So anyway, lots of potential. So I'm glad the education group's meeting tomorrow to be thinking about these things. Are there any other points that people want to make? It's coming up to 7:30, and personally, I don't mind at all if we finish at 7:30, but we do have time. Tony.
Yeah, I'm unmuting. Okay, yeah. I just wanted to say I thought it was a very good conversation. And in a way, it was a conversation that took place without any feeling that we're in a war zone. Now, what I have felt about some previous conversations that we've had is there's almost and in which issues of normalization have been discussed. is there's almost a sort of sense of careless talk costs lives. You know, that if you've got to really watch what you say, and we're not going to progress on issues like this, which raise difficulties, if we're too careful about how we express ourselves. So I just wanted to add my appreciation, and I think we should this is a kind of bridge, perhaps, because we had a seminar before about issues of normalization, which I think was quite fraught, and this hasn't been fraught, and maybe it's an issue we should return to. And I want to thank you very much for a really good conversation this evening, Poppy and Leah.
Thank you so much. That's really nice. Yeah, and then maybe partly because it's, you know, we're talking about real situations. But I would echo, go visit, definitely go. Poppy, do you have any concluding remarks you want to make? It's not compulsory, but just give you the space to do so.
I was really honored to have this opportunity to reflect with you on the questions that have been troubling me over this past while. You know, I wrote my memoir about my time on the West Bank, and I'm now writing a novel based on the same place at the same time. And I'm looking for beta readers, i.e. people willing to read and comment. And at that point, I withdraw.
Well, people who are keen to read more and comment on Poppy's draft, get in touch with Daniel.
That's right.
We'll pass on your offers to Poppy. So I really want to thank. Nice comments coming in the chat. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Poppy, for the conversations we've had leading up to today and for being so open this evening. And with that, I don't know if there's any announcements that people need to make. Daniel's put his email in, and if people want to come up, but it's the same email that you would have got the link from. So do send your offers to them. I'm going to go, and thank you all for coming.
Can we just say thank you to you both for a really moving and stimulating and interesting conversation. I'm really grateful to you both. Thank you from all of us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Lovely. Thanks.